Now it's the dead of winter, and this is a great time to scout for whitetails. And I'm sure there are a lot of you around the country that are looking for whitetails right now. Your shed rally's coming up soon, all the shed hunting videos and articles, and it's time to get out in the woods. And boy, I'm itching. I'm in the woods all the time. I was in the woods on snowshoes in the last few days for 3.5 hours, 5 hours per day, and I'm constantly scouting whitetails and whitetail habitat for a living. That's what I do. I've seen 5 key ingredients that you need to find the best whitetail habitat, to scout the best whitetail habitat, and to ultimately find a great spot to hunt this fall. Whether you're looking on public land, you're scouting on private land, whatever. There's 5 key ingredients. Now, number 1, this may come as a surprise, but when you find junk timber, the lower value timber, the lower value habitat, that is often the best habitat. And I'll give you an example. Red cedar, autumn olive, box elder. There's a lot of timber out there that foresters and wildlife professionals might look at it and say, oh boy. And I've even seen some really bad habitat hack jobs and hack and squirt and girdling on aspen, which is one of the best wildlife and whitetail species for regeneration. And box elder is right up there too, folks. Don't forget that. I've even seen autumn olive. It used to be that on a lot of the wildlife plans and state plans, federal programs, that they're telling you to remove autumn olive. And I've actually seen, and I've large property in Lower Michigan, Jackson, about 400 acres, Jackson area, where the wildlife resource professional in that area that managed the federal program actually allowed the landowner not to remove the autumn olive, because with the timber he had on there and the grasses they had planted, his autumn olive and those thickets were the best source of wild habitat for small game and whitetails on his property. That's where the most sign was, and he actually got an okay to leave those alone. So I've seen that trend actually the last few years, where autumn olive never takes over a stand of hardwoods. Once it's shaded out, it's dead. Red cedar, you can use that to manipulate. You can use it as base cover. You can hollow out 40 to 60% on the inside in pockets and convert it. Box elder, incredible regeneration for wildlife whitetails. None of it's great timber species. Even aspen, the best aspen, they're harvesting for pulp, and it's a very low timber value. So in general, the more the junk timber that you have, the higher the whitetail value. It's just a quick scan. You can just look at the property. There's a lot of junk timber right here behind me, and I won't tell you exactly where this is at, but it's an area that has great whitetail, and it's really poor timber value. Now, number 2, upland habitat is an incredible wildlife bonanza, and that includes whitetails. So where you have that ultimate combination of early successional growth, typically in the form of hardwood regeneration, shrubs, gray dogwood, willows, whatever it might be, conifers, and lots of shrubs. But grasses, weeds, briars, you have that ultimate combination where it's early successional growth, and this would be overgrown pastures, overgrown ag fields. A lot of times where you have that combination, you find the best wildlife species, and that's where some of my favorite places to look for sheds in the spring, and at the same time to scout whitetails, because you never know what's around the next corner. There's a lot of diversity and a great spot. And now the opposite of that, number 3, if you see giant stands of hardwoods, avoid those areas. Big, giant monocultures of hardwoods, high timber value. But again, the opposite of number 1, the opposite of number 2, where it's monoculture. Hardwoods in general typically do not have a real favorable stand of great whitetail habitat, great wildlife populations. They really are the opposite. It's a giant monoculture. There's no food. Even if you have acorns, it's really a season-specific, a month-specific food source, and it's just one type of food source. So really, when you see on a map, when you see on an aerial photo, when you're driving down the road, you're looking at a potential new spot to hunt, and you see giant patches of hardwoods, then avoid those areas. I really encourage you, even if you're looking at your next parcel to buy, not a great quality to have if you're looking for wildlife and whitetails in general. But the cool thing about hardwoods and any of this is that there's always a positive, and when you find those giant patches of hardwoods, look to the side. look at those edges that they create, look at where they actually meet some diversity and where they actually blend into other types of habitat, and that's where you'll find not only wildlife, but whitetails. Now the theme of this, and number 4 goes along the theme with number 1, 2, 3, is diversity, of course. And one way to recognize this really quickly, even if you don't know the timber types and you're not really sure of the habitat you're in, what type it is, what type it's going to be, what type you're looking at, what type you're scouting, is that you're looking at the overstory of that timber, meaning that you want an extremely uneven overstory. That's something I've recognized, I've been writing about and talking about for many years. If you look at shrubs, all an even overstory, grass, all an even, conifer, hardwoods, they're all the same monoculture, it's all the same overstory. But where you have that mix, where you have hardwoods that blends in with conifers, it blends in with shrubs, it blends in with grasses, and back and forth and up and down, if you just look at that overstory, that's going to tell you there's diversity, that there's wildlife, and ultimately that the whitetail potential is much higher than on those even ages. So even if it's all shrubs, even if it's all grasses, briars, weeds, even if it's all hardwood regeneration, the same age, even though each one of those is a valuable component, red cedars, conifer, they're all valuable pieces of habitat. When it all is one and the same in a monoculture, that is bad, and all you need to do is look at that overstory. If it's uneven, the more uneven the better, and that'll be a great sign that you're in the right location for whitetails and you're scouting the right location. Now 5th, and this is an interesting take, and this is something I see when I'm walking great whitetail parcels where there's great habitat features. We're just making sure that they're aligning correctly, that they complement each other, and that they can actually define deer so that then you can define how you hunt. But when I'm walking a lot of these outstanding whitetail properties, and maybe you can even think of some of the places you've been to, wherever around the country, public land or private, is that there's an abundant wildlife and small game population. So from grouse to pheasants to squirrels to rabbits to whitetails, where you have a great blend of them all. And I've seen a lot of locations, even around here, where you have pheasant in one location, but you might not have deer, grouse. You have grouse in another area where you have really good aspen regeneration and you have that high stem count, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a great whitetail population. Other areas, if your property has a lot of squirrels and not much else, that's not a really good sign, because that signifies you probably have an all hardwood parcel, which isn't really conducive to pheasant, grouse, and certainly not rabbits, and of course whitetails. So where you find the most abundant game populations, you're going to have the best whitetail habitat that you can scout and find and hunt. And it's interesting when you look at that, when you think of that in a big picture, when you find the best whitetail habitat, when you're scouting, when you locate that, then whitetail habitat to me, because of the edge that whitetails require, because of that diversity of habitat that whitetails require, you typically find, if you're searching for whitetail, you find great wildlife populations on the side. So think of that relationship. The more small game species, the better. The more bird species, the better. And you're ultimately going to recognize and find quickly, just in a quick scan, those impressive and high quality whitetail locations to actually hunt, buy, lease, whatever you want to do to manage your herd and manage whitetails. Think about those 5 quick, really short, quick scanned items and ingredients that you can find for whitetails and scouting whitetails this wintertime, and I know that you'll be on track for your next great hunt this fall.